Stories for Action Activators series. Today we're very happy to have Asher J joining us. Asher is a creative conservationist. She's a National Geographic Explorer whose captivating paintings, campaigns, and films drive a single mission: to incite global action on behalf of wildlife conservation and biodiversity loss. Thank you so much for being with us today, Asher.
Real pleasure to be here.
Could you begin by just telling us a little background on how you fell into your work and also the things that have led you to the driving mission?
Sure. I think it all began for me as a child, and most of us come to do, if we're lucky particularly, what we are most passionate about as kids. When I was a child, I really cared about the world at large, particularly the natural world, which I saw continue being eroded around me. I grew up reading a lot of David Attenborough and watching BBC Earth. So I was deeply molded by just the magic and diversity and awe of wild. And to see that being lost for all time to come felt like such a grave betrayal of our role as stewards in this world, that I felt truly internally called from a very young age to speak out against it, to be an active proponent towards preservation measures. And so I always volunteered, like my summer vacations and Christmas holidays, towards rehabilitation, restoration programs, catch and release, things like that. And I just felt like hands-on impact was the way to go initially. So as much as I could, I would. Then over time, my mother told me that I was so emotionally discombobulated and unsettled or perturbed by what I saw that I was more a victim than a proactive agent for change. And so because of conversations I had with her, I wound up pursuing a path that took me away for a brief while from the conservation narrative and being in the sciences or involved in a tangible way with the environment. And so I pursued fashion designing, branding and marketing, which it's interesting because it found its way back into like this new age sort of interdisciplinary career that I have sculpted for myself. And I call myself a creative conservationist. What I found interesting in combining those two terms was that I was applying my creativity through the sieve of design, because design is all about application, the marriage between form and function, versus art for art's sake, which can be rather in the ethers and just about creating for the sake and pleasure of creating, which is a privilege. And I do understand there's a place for that. And there was definitely a place for that in the past. But now more so than ever, I think all of us should be applying ourselves intentionally, directionally towards addressing and ameliorating many of the realities currently and urgently confronting us, because it is to our immediate detriment, as seen even with COVID-19 unfolding. So as I grew up, I realized I didn't want to be sort of a business or an individual that would contribute to charities as a tax break. I felt like that was not enough, and I needed to come back into the front lines and find a way to apply what I knew how to do in a new way. So I leveraged all my creative abilities towards communicating data points, science, and just any kind of information that needed to reach and mobilize the masses. Because a lot of why things are the way they are is because people don't know, or they don't know it in the way that they can understand it. So it might be revealed to them as statistics or just data bytes, but it's not emotionally intuitive. It doesn't create the right level of catalyzation within an individual, because it hasn't reached them on a scale and in a vocabulary that is personally intuitive to them. So for me, I found that that's where I most derived application for my capabilities, because I understood mass psychology, social psychology, and I also loved applying design towards helping people come into a moment of epiphany where they were like, aha, that little light bulb went off in my head, and now I know, just from a deep understanding, just from a space of internal wisdom, as opposed to just knowledge, which is so transient and can come and go. So I think like when you really hit a point of wisdom within an individual, you mobilize them towards continual action, because they fall in love, they care, they feel like it's a part of who they are, and it becomes an extension and expression of their personal investment into self and the world. And so that's how my career has evolved into all the different fields of media that I've gotten into, because I've just said yes to the means, because so long as it gets to the end, which is to help mobilize awareness and enable action in this world, I'm for whichever conduit gets me there.
And you haven't just heard secondhand about the things happening of wildlife trafficking and biodiversity loss. You've also done a great deal of international traveling and seen these things firsthand. Can you speak a little bit to that experience?
Yeah, so one of the cool ways in which I've structured my efforts is I think it's very hard to authentically communicate a narrative from a truly insightful place within you if you haven't actually experienced it, because it's very different to know about something from a distance than to personally be there and experience the hate a community can harbor towards a herd of elephants because their crops have been trampled upon and that's their only source of livelihood. Because from a Western perspective, where elephants are not in my backyard, nothing I own is getting destroyed and decimated by the species, and I just want to see it alive and well because I like going on occasional safari and seeing this magnificent animal alive and about. So it's a very interesting time to be alive in, because there are so many perspectives depending on where you are in that storyline, right? And as conservationists, if we approach it solely from the perspective of this needs to be kept alive for its own intrinsic value, it's all well and good, but if the reality and context does not support it, no matter how many times you try to say that, people are not actually going to be a part of that solution process. So to get them to understand it, you need to go on the front lines and talk to them, understand why it's not working for them, and see if there is a tangible solution you can implement to address the human-wildlife conflict point. And being on the ground has allowed me to have those kinds of conversations, to understand truly whether something can or cannot work. And sometimes the campaign needs to start there. That is the first entry point, is to address the locals before you can even get the international community to be involved in the effort of protecting the elephants on the ground. So yes, I want to appeal to donors and funding externally from brands and from larger foundations so that this nonprofit on the ground can address this point of conflict. But if I don't go there and work with the locals on how they can effectively communicate with one another and address that gap, that hiatus, you're not actually going to get anything tangibly done. So for me, it's about being on the ground, understanding from their perspective before you come in from your own agenda and with a sweeping solution and conclusion and just spoon feed it to people, which will never effectively get internalized or acted upon. And even recently working with a brand, looking at brand accountability, supply chain transparency, I went to explore whether or not Sambazon, which is a company that produces wild harvest acai-based products, to go to the Amazon and truly understand if this company has real transparency and is giving back to the communities on the ground, the indigenous people that it works with. And they do, and it's magnificent to see an effective story where a small scale company truly has that commitment and delivers on that commitment by ensuring that they include the local people in the dialogue. And it's not like we go in there to say, hey, you know what, you've done this for us, so we're just going to give you a score. If that's not what they want, there's no point going there and giving them something which is infrastructure that just fails them at the end of the day, because it's not even at a pace that they want that development to occur. And it may not even be how they learn what they're seeking. So it's so important to go on the ground to have those really indispensable conversations that allows you to create solutions that can actually be implemented versus this idealism that we can go in with, where you can tout solutions that just never actually find real world application.
And that's a concept that can be applied to so many different fields and issues. And on that, as we're having this conversation in mid-April, in the midst of the COVID-19 pandemic and the quarantine, can you speak a little bit to how that has affected your work, both the logistics and also if you see any overlap between the things that you focus on in your work?
A lot of travel that I had, which is an implicit part of my work, is to go to places constantly and document different narratives or help people tell their stories more effectively so they get heard. It's really offering a voice or a platform for those who have been marginalized and not been given the opportunity to even find true wholesome expression. It's like they get stymied even before they get that first chance to express themselves. And so what I do through my work is give them that moment of articulation. And to give them that focus, I need to be there. And so I was supposed to be in India in Jaipur for Wild 11, which is a massive gathering that happens every couple of years in different countries around the world, bringing together delegates from all around the world, filmmakers, artists, scientists, journalists, delegates from government agencies, to truly contemplate where we're heading, how we're heading there, while including Indigenous perspectives in the narrative. And we also take on like a case study almost when we're in that specific country to like address what's in the immediate background, right? So it's like if there are national parks buffering the Rajasthan area, then we would be directly invested in what gets conserved in that particular locale. So when you're actually doing this event, that event is not just about bringing people together, but having them leave behind a positive impact before we leave that place. So I really think there should be more conferences, events, gatherings that are application driven in this way, because there's so much money and carbon footprint behind bringing people together. It's absolutely vital that we come together and do so in person, because it's a very different thing from doing it virtually versus when you're actually in person, energetically connected in this room, brainstorming, coming up with real-time solutions. But when you apply that brilliance and find interdisciplinary application during the time that you're together, and you can leave something behind at the end of it that's positive, you're enriching while making that carbon footprint happen, right? So like there has to be a reason why we go somewhere and how we leave that place. Like, do we leave it better for having been there or not? And that's how I ask of every one of my travels as well, as when I go to places, am I leaving it better or not? Unfortunately this year, because everything got shoved in terms of travel because of the pandemic, my work now, I'm looking more at why the pandemic has even happened. Like zoonotic diseases is not something new to us. Their outbreaks have been more common. It's just not been on this scale ever before. But with Ebola last year, or like just looking at various other infections that have spread from wild animals, whether it's even from wild animals to livestock, swine flu, brucellosis, like anything that you think about that comes from the animals to either human civilization or humanity itself, seems to happen because there's less and less wilderness buffer zones, areas where there's enough space for wild to do its wild thing, while there's an extant level of biodiversity, which means there's a large array of organisms that these viruses and bacteria can occupy without pilfering into human civilization. Unfortunately, because as we've taken over more of the world, currently, if you look at global biomass, we are over 97% of global biomass, which means less than like 3% is redwood forests, blue whales, every kind of whale you can imagine. That's 3% of global biomass. So we have pretty much occupied organically as matter most of this planet. We've colonized in such a great scale that if any bacteria or viruses get released into the world, we're the primary host. We are the most available resource for these organisms, these microorganisms to occupy. And that's why we're more susceptible, vulnerable to outbreaks going forward. So the more wilderness we cull and the more we occupy space, the more likely we're going to be infected. It's just basic math of the science. You can deduce it just by connecting the dots. So what we need to do more is opting for plans like E.O. Wilson's Half Earth, which is to protect half of the Earth's biodiversity and biological reserves, which means you're building resilience by offering genetic diversity to this overall context. And the biosphere, as the term denotes, should be biologically resilient. And it was constructed through deep time, through evolution, to be that way, by offering this complexity of living organisms from the tree of life, from this massive cladogram. And we've just pilfered that into this singular strand that is us. And our lives itself is dependent on this larger context, which we seem to be so removed from. We think we're apart from it instead of a part of it. So that mentality needs to change. And if there's any wake-up call out of this pandemic, it is that insight that we should leave with, because whether it's climate change, whatever the reasons that we're pilfering into wild, that needs to stop right here, right now. unless we want to be having more outbreaks, more disease, more loss, like greater droughts, greater wildfires, more disasters, which results in massive economic hits. Like we cannot afford the economic hits nature is going to throw our way if we keep on the current trajectory. So my work has automatically shifted to raise awareness along those lines at present. So I've been creating more campaigns about like coronavirus itself, like why is the zoonotic disease in our vocabulary at present and in our reality? It's because of the fact that we brought this about. This is something that we need to take responsibility for. Whether or not it came from a wet market, it's easy to, yes, even I briefly was like, we should hold the place that physically launched the disease. Like if you wanted to talk about China and its consumption habits and its proclivity for TCM or wildlife trade, then yes, you want to hold that nation accountable on that front. But really globally, we're responsible for this. All of us are part of this narrative of like sacrificing nature to find greater expression as human beings, and that's just not ever been a thread and framework of existence that is going to work in our benefit.
It's not just the argument of protecting nature for nature's sake, but if you also want to make the public health and the economic argument, there's plenty to back that as well.
And that's the interesting thing, right? Like people don't realize like ecological collapse is just going to enunciate social and economic collapse. So it's totally tethered together, yet we seem to think one can exist at the cost of the other continually, which is why we continue to extend Keystone Pipeline or drill in the Arctic or do any of these ridiculously ignorant things, which all science indicates we should stop doing now more than ever. And yet here we are getting sanctions removed, regulations rolled back so that people can go drill, baby, drill. And it's just not a viable recourse anymore. Like we have to be acting. Even if we're being utterly selfish and acting in our own interest, it is in our best interest to save nature. So why on earth are we being so self-destructive and self-sabotaging? It's like we're in the most toxic relationship with our own self right now. And that's really what we need to start unpacking and understanding as to why we want to act against our own well-being.
And in creating that change and creating that education and awareness, there are a lot of divides that need to be bridged. Can you speak to how you have done that personally in your work, not only with the work itself that intrinsically brings people together and unifies ideas, but what you've seen from your work and experience on the ground?
It's interesting because the places that are most biologically diverse are also the ones that are more economically compromised. And that's usually because we operate like the developed nations, the post-industrial and industrializing nations occupy those countries in terms of vested interests, in terms of sending our corporations there to source what we need without any kind of understanding of empowering the local dynamic for its own reasons to be self-protecting and self-sustaining. So you have like, Dole and Colgate and all these people holding massive acreage in African nations. So African people don't have a say in their own backyard about how their land and resources are managed. The number of hoteliers that go in to occupy wildlife national parks so that they can run safari operations without any regard for whether or not their very footprint of being there is actually eroding into the landscape that they occupy. And again, this is all because the locals in those areas are economically compromised, looking for opportunities, incentives, ways in which they can develop their backyard, but it's often happening at the cost of them and at the cost of the backyard. So for instance, when I went to the Serengeti, I did a 2-week artisan residency at Four Seasons. And one of the things I had to do was work with their staff so that their staff can understand that they come from, like, they're Maasai warriors, they're like tribesmen, they've come from absolute rural conditions where they don't have access to the power grid and they don't live in the way that we are used to and what we take for granted in developed nations. And so when they come into Four Seasons and start working there after living in a rural community, what they're seeing is suddenly this like cornucopia of access to resources water's just running in every tap. You know, suddenly there are taps in every room, and there are switches everywhere that turns lights on, fans on, air conditioners on. They can regulate environmental conditions through like internal temperature settings. So they're just completely overwhelmed by what they consider the sudden abundance. So they think that, hey, this is like free for all. And so they leave water running, they leave the taps on, they leave lights on. They don't understand that those resources are coming from their backyard. And so part of the education was to have the community understand how to create posters and campaign within themselves so that they can better educate that, hey, this is our backyard, and we should be teaching Four Seasons how they should be using our resources. And we need to take claim and hold some level of empowerment, as well as it's almost like having pride in your own land and in your own self.
Can you speak a little to your message in a bottle exhibit?
Sure. So I created this work in 2012, and since then it's grown to be 365 bottles, and each bottle represents a different voice in the world. And I wanted to bring together sort of a bait bowl of voices because I believe in the wisdom of the crowds. Yes, you know, when you talk about one person's strong message about the impact of plastics or consumerism on a specific environment or species, it's heard. But when you hear the whole like orchestra of voices speaking for all of the ecosystems that plastic infiltrates and affects adversely, and all of the species that are choking on it or dying from it, and how it even cycles back to public health and, you know, its impacts on us, on our well-being. Because even if you're drinking out of a plastic water bottle, it has a lot of additives in the plastic's composition itself. You don't know how it degenerates over time. So the number of estrogenic compounds and chemicals, soft additives that it leaches into the water or any beverage that it holds within it is incredible. It's like, it's exponential. There's a lot that degrades into that beverage, which you don't realize every time you leave it out in the sun, or you're carrying it, or it moves, temperature variations, all of these things results in that particular plastic poisoning the very beverage that's within it. And then you're assimilating it and it goes into your body. And then we wonder where all these cancers come from, or where, you know, all these health disorders or endocrine disruptions happen. And it happens because we're putting it in portable containers for our convenience, but it's to our own detriment. So we need to rethink the idea of convenience, the idea of how we want to live in a world that's kind of use and throw disposable economy, versus can we really think about ways how we streamline what we do and how we do it, the packaging in which we consume it. And if we think all of those entry points through, then we're going to be more aware of the not just our health and well-being, but the health of the planet and well-being. So like if you think about it, it's like planet, people, and purpose. And those three need to intersect and result in sort of a Venn diagram that results in coexistence. So that's really what we're striving for, is what I think. With Message in a Bottle, the reason why it had impact was because I could use the platform to communicate a voice that was less known. For instance, a small nonprofit and the president or the founder of that nonprofit who genuinely cares about an issue in a small community island nation, versus, you know, James Cameron, who has global reach, right? So if you can bring those voices together on the same platform, then one voice amplifies the relevance and significance of another voice. So I think if we're intelligent as artists or designers, we can leverage platforms that we're able to create to integrate people, voices, brands, such that they can bounce off of each other's PR. So it's all about like understanding also publicity and outreach, and leveraging communication strategies through the right portals, and as well the right individuals or identities like brands, personalities, to ensure that the message is advanced cohesively and collectively for maximum impact. Because the average person who walked into that exhibit was captivated because Harrison Ford, Alec Baldwin, and all these names participated in it, right? And their voices were heard in the immersive environment, because like as you walk through the bottles whisper the messages to you. And so they were intrigued by and captivated by Harrison Ford. But then after that, they heard, you know, the coral reef scientists working in the Maldives or in Palau about, you know, species that they've never thought about. So like, or about nudibranchs, or things like that are just on a scale that we don't think is important. So I think it's about making sure that the things that need to get heard find that amplification by associating with things that are probably already well heard because it's a platform that has already got mass appeal, but it hasn't been utilized to leverage these lesser known aspects of the world.
And are there any other calls to action that you'd like to give the public, either in relation to the COVID-19 that's occurring currently or to your work in general?
Yeah, I would say for both. So I think in all of what I've done and what I continue to do, what I've realized is how you engage yourself, how you show up within you, and how you extend that is so critical. Look at how we deal with loss. Look at how we deal with all the different fears and demons within us, the shadow side within us that keeps us from showing up fully in a healthy way for not just ourselves, but for our relationships, for our immediate circle, because that's what you're extending further and further into the world. So when you're talking about your impact, it starts in every regard, emotionally, psychologically, spiritually, and then of course as a consumer habit. And the consumption itself is an extension of what your internal understanding. So evolve that internal understanding. Stop fixating, if you can, to and flip that narrative, toss the coin and see it from a more positive perspective, because in that way, you're not only evolving how you've shown up, but you're going to start thinking about in each moment, am I showing up in the right way? So I think really it's a good time for us to take stock and to show up from a space of wisdom, awareness, growth, transformation, as opposed to, continuing along business as usual, having hidden away from this reality we didn't want to be faced by, and just coming out the other side of this rabbit hole, being more like a rabbit than we ever were before. We can't just be kind of hiding from the harsh realities facing us anymore. So I think that's one takeaway from the pandemic. And the other call to action I would leave people with is, yes, it's absolutely imperative in today's world to change daily habits. Try to conserve as much energy as possible, because we take resources for granted. Everything is infinite, and it's not. It's all finite. We're tapping into resources and we're actually taking from our children's future. So be truly mindful and don't be so selfish as to only think about you and your lifespan. Think about lifespans ahead of you, because you've given birth to many people have given birth to the next generation already, and that generation is going to be left with such a sparse future. And how selfish are we to constantly rob from tomorrow today? And secondly, I would say, beyond your everyday resource impact and how you consume, if you can change your immediate community, if you can change your immediate backyard to engage more positively, then do that. For instance, I come from New York, where we've recycled pretty much everything. We do plastics 1 through 7. We do every kind of cloth you can imagine. There's textile reclaiming cloth points. We definitely recycle all glass, cans. And here in Montana, where I am currently, and I'm living between Montana and New York in Manhattan, and I'm seeing the juxtaposition where so little is recycled, so much is ending up in the landfill, and it shows me that this beautiful backyard that I have privilege and access to is being taken for granted. So this has become my next mission, and I'm actively daily looking at ways to talk to as many people in the local community to address how we're going to take on waste management and recycling, because if we don't address that now, we're only going to be confronted with further land loss and mismanagement of resources. And technically, at the end of the day, waste is a resource. We have to stop thinking of it as waste. Nature does not waste. Waste is a beginning point for life again. It recycles, it repurposes into finding expression as a living cycle. So why does humanity put so much energy into creating objects or materials that are just tossed away at the end of the day, and they don't even biodegrade, so they don't give back to the land that they're thrown into? It shows a complete lack of application of our ingenuity, our brilliance. We are capable of incredible feats. We came up with the pyramids, we've come up with the internet. We do extraordinary things that connect life on a scale that has never been seen before in terms of human consciousness or living consciousness. And yet we're even capable of enlightenment. We have Buddha, and we have prophets. And what is wrong with us that we don't seem to find a solution for things like waste management? So I think we need to find those kind of solutions, not just in our immediate backyards, but to hold the larger schematic accountable to also to be part of those solutions with us. And the other thing that I'd say is like, don't give up on people who don't see eye to eye with you or who don't think it's important yet, because you'll be amazed how quickly they change if you have compassion for them and explain it to them in the right language. Because at the end of the day, when we can have a conversation, that's what matters. It's inclusive and we respect one another and we are having more transparent dialogues about what matters and how can we promote collective existence. Don't ever give up on people just because they disagree with you. Like, love them for it because that's where they're at, but they will shift with you if you have an inclusive conversation instead of judge and condemn them for that specific moment of ignorance, because it's all contextual and where we're at because of circumstances, because of life, what we've been exposed to, and having the right like soundbite come in at the right time can shift an attitude so quickly. I've seen myself change, I've seen others change. It's highly possible that we'll all change and lead to a better world. So don't lose hope, don't get all doom and gloom, and don't be like, oh, the end of the world is here. It's not. Like, we're gonna do great. Just like focus on the light and focus on the right, you know? So yeah, that's something I would always leave people with, because people get very bleak very quickly, especially with a pandemic around. They're like, right. Oh my God, we're done. It's the apocalypse.
Right.
It's really not. So I think it's a great time for us to wake up and do better than we've done.
Solutions-oriented conversations only.
Yeah, absolutely.
And thank you so much for being with us today, Asher. Do you mind telling folks how they can find you online and follow your work?
Sure. Yeah, you can look me up at Earth Heiress on Instagram and Twitter, which is just EARTHHEIRESS, and that's basically inspired by Simple Life and Paris Hilton, because I thought, you know, if she can inherit like wealth, I think we should inherit health and like the planet. So I was like, I'm going to inherit the earth, and we each inherit the earth, and I think that's really what we need to put our money back into. So that's my handle. And then, asherj.com, and feel free to hit me up on social media. I'm always doing something or the other to like advance the overall narrative of my efforts. So I look forward to connecting.
Thank you so much for sharing your story with us today, Asher. There's so much we can learn from not only witnessing your work, but hearing your experiences and calls to action, and that experience of working together with different groups to make positive action happen for the planet. So thank you so much for joining.